What is going on, internet? It's your boy Shouldn't Paint So Fast, and I'm talking in a video for once. And today, we're going to be doing a locomotive weathering tutorial. Specifically, a Broadway Limited GP30u in Santa Fe Blue Bonnet colors. And as you can see straight out the box, the detail on this thing is gorgeous. I've always associated Broadway Limited more with like the steam era and, like the early transition diesels, less the modern era stuff. I mean, to the extent that the GP30 is really modern. And they've knocked it out of the park. As far as I can tell, there's no details that are missing. There isn't anything physically I would add to it. Just did a fantastic job. The paint is gorgeous. I did pop it on my test track. Looks great, sounds great, runs great. I have no real complaints with it. Almost kind of feel bad weathering it. Ha! Kidding. So for the first order of business, we are going to be doing a patch job on this locomotive. Not for BNSF, for SPSF. Fantasy paint jobs! Start furiously typing your angry comments below. Okay, step one, applying the decals for the SPSF patches. I don't have a lot of specific advice for applying waterslide decals. If you're watching this channel, you probably have some familiarity with how to do it. The main thing is I always trim my decals and get them as close to the print as I can to avoid getting as much of the transparent film on the finished product as possible. And of course, when you're done, applying a glossy clear coat on top, lest your decals become cloudy. I'll also say, too, that I don't necessarily believe that you always need to put some sort of setting fluid, like microsol or Solvaset, on your decals unless you find that they're not adhering to the surface. Particularly like cheaper decals, like if you ever have done Warhammer or anything, those transfers are really thick and you have to just soak them in Solvaset to get them to stick to anything. But thinner decals like these micro marks that I'm using, if they're sticking just fine with no decal fluid, I don't really see the point, to be honest with you. Your results may vary though. And yes, I know all about foam cradles for doing model trains. I don't use them because I find them tedious. But if you like them, you are more than welcome to use them. I just personally find it easier just to use a little sheet of styrofoam like this and some packing peanuts so I can hold my model at whatever angle I'd like to while I'm working on it. And there we have it. If you look at prototype pictures of former Santa Fe locomotives and, of course, former BN locomotives after the BNSF merger, you'll find that the patches were almost never applied perfectly. There was always paint chipped. Some of the letters were always crooked. So I'm not going to stress out getting them lined up. They're close enough for government work, and that was how they were on the real trains, so that's just fine with me. So, on to airbrushing. As you can see, I'm a Grex man myself. The biggest piece of advice I can give someone who is getting into airbrushing is get yourself one of these. This is an inline air regulator. This will make your life so much easier. I think pretty much every single airbrush manufacturer makes one of these. If not, you can get a Grex one and hook it up to your Panche or a Wada. I'm not going to tell anybody. But all this does is it allows you to fine-tune the air pressure coming out of the brush from the source, so you don't have to mess around with the compressor. What I do personally, I leave my compressor set at like 35 pounds. I believe the maximum pressure for these is like 40 pounds. So I just leave it set at like 35 pounds, and then the hose sort of becomes like an air reservoir at that point. So you get a much more consistent airflow through the brush. And then obviously, I usually start with it turned down. That's up actually. I start with it turned down, and I gradually increase the pressure until I get a spray that I like. Combined with the fact that this is a double action airbrush, makes it very easy to control, and you will just have a much better time weathering with one of these. I can't recommend it enough. So as far as colors go, we're going to start, I usually start at the top, so we're going to start by doing the exhaust blackening around the exhaust port. My go-to color for doing this is Vallejo Model Air Dark Gray Blue. Why dark blue? Part of it is because the locomotive itself is blue. This is going to be a lot easier to blend with the existing color and prevent it from turning too blacken too quickly. I don't want this locomotive to look like, it's been sitting in the junkyard for 15 years. I want it to look like it's been at least somewhat maintained, somewhat cared for. So I'm going to be very careful and deliberate about how much blackening I apply. The other reason is, if you've ever seen something that's covered in soot, like if you've ever seen the exhaust of a locomotive, obviously, or the exhaust pipes on a truck, or even like a chimney, smoke is a very fine particle. That's why with larger scales, you would normally use something like a dry pigment. With HO scale like this, a dry pigment is almost a little too big, and it looks like it's covered in like concrete dust or something to my eyes. The gray blue has a really nice sort of matte effect to it that makes it look like it's covered in a powder and not just a black spray. Sometimes, like my SPSF Kodachrome locomotives that are actually black on the roof, this will actually end up looking lighter than the black paint that was applied to the roof of the locomotive. So it also helps the exhaust staining stand out a little more on the finished product rather than, if I were just painting black on top of black, well, there might be some difference in terms of texture when you're done, but you're not going to notice the weathering. This is a different enough color from just a flat black that it will show up more on the finished product. And in this case, like I said, when you're applying it over a blue coat to start off with, it'll be much easier to blend. So I'm just spraying this directly out of the bottle. Model Air is thinned pretty heavily as it is, and plus this brush is just such a beast, you almost don't need to really thin the paints too much to get a consistent spray. Alrighty, next to simulate accumulated dust and grime along the fuel tank and the bottom of the locomotive and the trucks, I usually use this. This is Dust from AK Interactive. I think this color has been discontinued. I know I got this in a weathering set a long time ago, but you could obviously mix up Vallejo or even the new generation AK acrylics to roughly match this color. Nice part is this stuff is mixed super thin, so you can basically spray it directly out of the bottle, unless you're going for a specific effect. You can see I still have a little bit of gray blue that is hiding somewhere deep down inside the airbrush. I did take it apart and clean it. But that's actually okay. That adds us a little more color variation. No finesse here, just reach in, grab the locomotive, apply a light coat all along the bottom. Again, your goal with this should not be 100% uniformity. You should be trying to keep it a little bit of as random as possible while you're painting. Humans are actually pretty terrible at devising truly random patterns. So it's something you need to be conscious of and aware of when you're doing weathering like this, is trying to avoid making it too consistent. Obviously, dirt and grime will accumulate in certain areas on particular locomotives, but within those areas, you want to try to avoid painting in straight lines. You can see I'm constantly feathering the airbrush. I'm not holding it in one place, just sort of moving it in an oval pattern. Alrighty, next step is pin washes and panel lining. I just used Tamiya panel liner for this. Dark brown I use for the yellow areas, and black I'm going to be using for the blue areas. I'm not going to be going around every single panel with the panel liner. I think at this scale that just looks weird, but I am going to be using it in, like in this case, the air intake grills, the radiator grills, the dynamic brake grills, to simulate accumulated dust and debris inside of the grates. And also a little bit on the top of the locomotive, again inside this like air filter hatch up here, where soot and detritus would collect. Like that. At this small of a scale, I think it's really easy to go overboard with panel lining. It's the great debate in the modeling community. That's the great debate in the modeling community about highlighting panels and different joints and everything. You see it a lot in like the aircraft modeling communities, people at each other's throats about, oh, you shouldn't be pre-shading, or oh, every panel doesn't need a black outline. And at this scale, again, I think it is very easy to be overkill with that. But in this case, if you look at pictures of actual locomotives, you'll find that a lot of dust and debris does actually accumulate inside these fans and the grills and everything. So it's actually, I think it looks a lot more like the prototype. So I think giving it a wash like this actually adds to the photorealism, if that's what you're trying to go for. Nice part about these Tamiya panel liners is that they are enamel. So they give you some time if you want to do some blending like this. It's not going to dry instantly like an acrylic would. Suppose I should speak a little bit on, my philosophy on weathering. I don't want to say that I'm trying to be photorealistic here because I'm modeling a freelance prototype that never existed, right? The SPSF. For those of you that don't know, Southern Pacific and Santa Fe attempted to merge in the late 1980s, and the merger got voted down. There's a whole big story about it. Peter Dribble on YouTube, or Peter Dibble, I can't remember. I'll link his video He does a really good video explanation if you're curious as to why the merger didn't go through and all the controversy surrounding it. But I strive to make my models look as realistic as possible. I use a lot of reference material from former Santa Fe locomotives shortly after the BNSF merger, and of course, um, former Southern Pacific locomotives after the Rio Grande, and then shortly after Union Pacific mergers for my reference material. So I'm not totally flying by the seat of my pants here. In many cases, I'm just changing the UP or the BNSF patches to SPSF. But I'm also giving myself enough leeway by not modeling an exact prototype that someone can't say, well, that's wrong. And I can say, well, it can't be wrong because it never existed now, did it? um, just adding in some more washes around the fuel tanks. I'm going to be doing some fuel streaking here later in a minute, so I'm not going too overboard. I'm just trying to sort of work it into the little cracks and crevices, and then I can do the streaking later. Also going to use some of the brown wash on the truck frames, and just to add more visual interest. It's not just 3-color paint job, blue, yellow, and black. I will say also that my weathering process is not always 100% the same in between locomotives and cars, or even in between different locomotives and different railroads. I think it's important to have a broad repertoire of different skills one can use, but if you just don't think that it's necessary, or you don't feel like you just want to use a particular skill for that project, then that's totally fine. Like I said earlier, I've definitely used dry pigments and things before, but I've often just found that that technique is useful only in certain circumstances, and at smaller scales like this, I find that using traditional paints works better. But your mileage may vary with that. I don't believe there is an incorrect way to play with your trains. You can do whatever you want with your models. I'm just sharing my perspective, and if you happen to find it interesting or you happen to find it helpful in some ways, great. If you don't, that's totally fine too. Alrighty, it is a number of hours later. The pin washes have pretty much dried. So we're going to move on to adding some rust. Again, I don't want this thing to look like it's been sitting out in a field somewhere for 20 years, so I'm not going to go overboard with the rust. But by the mid to late 90s, which is the period I'm kind of going for, these locomotives did start to accumulate some rust on them. Like I said, in the early days of the BNSF and the later part of Santa Fe, they weren't always as on top of the painting as they used to be with these locomotives. So they would accumulate some rust, particularly on the trucks. A lot of the pictures you find of these later on in life, they've had some of the wheel bearings have been replaced, and those apparently were never painted because they just look like a rusty brown color, or they were just left in primer. My go-to rust color as of late is been Mission Models Light Transparent Rust. Well, the transparent part, I don't know if it's just the batch I got. It's not very transparent, but it is a good rusty color that is good for adding in some details. If you really water it down, or you really like try to dry brush this stuff, it will start to be a little transparent, but it's not like using an oil paint with thinner or something like that, right? There, you can sort of see there a little bit. It's starting to be a little transparent. You can see there as I wet my brush and kind of feather it out, it definitely has become a little more transparent. This is an acrylic, so you've got to work kind of fast with it. But still, as acrylics go, it's quite forgiving. Mission Models has become lately my go-to brand of paint for acrylics. They seem to be really knocking it out of the park. Both for brushing like this and for airbrushing straight out of the bottle. Works great. Of course, if you want to thin it, you can use not only their own Mission Models thinner, but you can also use like Vallejo thinner. And even some of the AK thinners will work just fine for it as well. You can see it goes on pretty thick. Then as you feather it, I'm just dipping my brush into water and sort of thinning it down on the model itself to the point where it sort of turns into a wash. Again, I'm going for a very subtle effect with this. I'm not trying to really make it look like these parts are rusting through or anything. Smaller scales like HO, like this, it's always very tempting to go overboard with the weathering, particularly with rust. Again, that's why while I'm weathering a model like this, I'm constantly looking at reference photos of the real thing. Again, that's not to say, if you want to do crazy weathering on your trains to the point of it not being realistic, you can totally do that. But if you're striving for authenticity like I am, then having reference photos is handy. Again, just more wet blending on the model itself. See a lot of photos of GP30s in particular that have a lot of rust around the battery boxes like this. Now for these bearing boxes that I was talking about earlier, also going to get the brake shoes. Okay, I've added a couple drops of burnt umber to my transparent rust, and I'm just going to go over again some of the rusting areas with that to simulate rust that has been fully oxidized and has now gone from orange to brown in color. Actually using Vallejo burnt umber, and it mixes just fine with the Mission models. Okay, now for the fun part. Doing some rust splatters. Taking old reliable here, this beat up old artist paintbrush I have laying around. I'm gonna wipe most of the paint off. My phone will focus. Toothpick. And again, I'm not gonna go overboard with this, but I do want to add just a few flecks of rust, particularly on the yellow part of the locomotive where it's most visible. We mentioned earlier that humans are very bad at doing random patterns, and this is a very good way of getting a very fine yet also very random splatters all over your model. Of course, you don't. If you want to use this technique for other things than just rust, like if you're a wargamer, you can do this with blood. If you're, I don't know, modeling an off-road vehicle, you can do this to get mud. Really nice, quick and easy way. One small detail that is very easy to overlook is the exhaust stack. Particularly in a turbocharged locomotive like this, the exhaust gases coming out of the engine will be very hot. And half the time they don't even bother painting the exhaust manifold. And even in cases when they do, the paint is going to burn off very quickly. And you'll get this nice dark rust all around the exhaust stack. Alrighty, next step is the fuel staining and doing some additional weathering on the trucks. And for that, using AK streaking grime. And I do apologize if you hear some noise from cars and birds and such. I have my garage door open. My studio's in the garage. And this stuff is a pure enamel, so it stinks. So I like to keep the garage door open while I'm working with it, lest my garage smell like paint thinner for the rest of the week. The cool part about using enamels for things like fuel stains and really fine streaking like this is that what are enamels? They are a petroleum product. They're made of mineral spirits. Obviously, diesel fuel and gasoline and jet fuel and whatever else you may be modeling is also a petroleum product. So naturally, it has that sort of sheen, and it flows the very similar way that kerosene or gasoline would, which makes it, again, to my eyes, it makes it look more authentic for fuel staining. It's something that we haven't quite been able to get with acrylics yet. Is just that really sort of fine sheen. You can see how much thinned down this is. And over the years, this jar is probably about 5 or 6 years old. Over the years, I've actually added more and more thinner to it just to keep it fresh. So you can see how thin this is as it goes on. And that will absolutely, when it dries, there'll just be, all you'll really see of this is just the sheen of the dried mineral spirits and a little bit of the pigment. And that is what we're going for fuel stains. And also for almost doing like pin washes here on the trucks. I'm sure you're probably asking right now, why don't I like using foam cradles? And why do I just prop my locomotives up on packing peanuts? The reason for that is just having more control over the angle of it. With foam cradles, you're stuck having your model pretty much at one angle. With this, I can prop the model up at whatever angle I need. And I also don't have to worry about, if I'm spraying a lacquer, for example, the lacquer overspray soaking into the foam and causing problems. I can just, when I'm done here, I just toss the foam peanuts away if they get contaminated. And if not, I just use them until they're no longer springy. The other good part about this being an enamel is they don't dry very quickly. So I can go in just with a Q-tip like this and feather the edges a little bit. Just kind of do a little bit of a wet blend. I do apologize if the audio has been weird. I got into film production a little bit when I was in high school. Geez, over a decade now. Boy, I feel old. And I'm slowly reteaching myself the basics of video editing and video production. And I'm messing around with different types of microphones. Like right now, I'm just recording off the phone audio. No idea how that's going to turn out. So I do apologize if the audio has been weirdly inconsistent with this. It's something I'm trying to relearn. Also, if you've never tried it, filming while you're painting like this is really tough. Right now I've got my phone set up on a sort of a flexible arm mount, which is how most people who do model content do their filming. But yeah, definitely a learning process. I'm fortunate that I've gotten to the point now with model making that's kind of the easy part, right, of making these videos. I don't have to think too much about the actual weathering. It's part of why I like it so much. It's a pretty brainless activity. All you're doing is just keeping in mind what you've seen on your reference photos and just going to town based on that. I'm not filming. I like to throw some tunes on. Great way to spend an evening. Okay, it is now the next morning. The enamels have totally dried. As you can see, I don't know if the phone is... Yeah, I don't think my camera is able to pick up on it, but there is a slight sheen that's still coming off the fuel stains. And again, that is just the residue from the mineral spirits. Let's see if I can maybe... Yeah, no. But again, to my eyes, it's one of those things that you won't notice until someone points it out to you, but once you do notice it, you'll never be able to unsee it. Alrighty, and speaking of subtle effects, AK weathering pencils. I believe this is a completely new idea from AK. I never remember seeing these before they came out with them. Kind of a new technique, still kind of figuring out sort of what to do with this. In this case, I'm using the Dust and Rain Marks pencil. And this won't show up very well on the yellow part of the locomotive, if not at all. I'm mainly using this on the blue part. Just very subtly. Going right around the upper corner of the car body. A little bit around the dynamic brake blister. And then what I do with this is then I just take a Q-tip. And again, almost like you're wet blending. Just kind of feather it out. Very subtle, but it is also something that, again, I feel like once you know that it's there, and once you figure out how to do this, it'll drive you nuts if you don't do it. I know before the weathering pencils came out, and people who just don't want to use them, I've also seen them use dry pastels for this. And that'll totally work. Kind of a small area here. This is going to work a lot better on the dynamic brake blister moving forward. You do got to be a little careful with this if you're working in an area that has fine details like lifting hooks or really fine grab irons, because pencils being more solid than a brush will smack those suckers right off your model, so do have to be careful with that. Again, I have no idea if the camera is even going to pick up on this. Let me pop you all off the tripod here. Yeah, you can see it a little bit. Get some cotton residue off the model. Dumbass neighbor with his lifted Cummins. Apologize for that. Again, subtle, but once you see it, you'll never be able to unsee it. Alrighty, and I think what our last step is going to be, the exhaust staining on the blue part of the locomotive ended up being a little too subtle, I think. And also the fact that I painted the manifold after I did the exhaust staining. I need to go over it again. So just on the blue part, I'm going to use some AK Satin Black, first generation acrylic. I'm not even going to bother putting the paint cup on my airbrush. I'm literally going to put about 3 drops of it just in the top of the brush. Alrighty, top coat time. AK Interactive Matte Varnish. Alrighty, so after 2 coats of the AK Spray Matte Clear Coat, everything's looking nice and even, nice unified finish. There's one more step, and again, this is going to be one of those things that once someone points it out to you, you will never be able to not unsee it, and that is the mirrors. A lot of companies don't even bother painting them silver, which is a shame because, again, once someone points it out to you, it's one of those things that you'll never be able to unsee it, and it just can take a perfect paint job and just make it stick out like a sore thumb, to my eyes at least. So to handle that, I'm using our trusty Molto liquid chrome pen. This is the 1mm tip. Alrighty, and there we have it. This guy took me about 3.5, maybe 4 days to weather. I'm sort of notorious in the fact that I like to let each layer of paint dry thoroughly in between each coat and in between each layer. You could definitely do this in a weekend if you wanted to, speed up the drying process with a hairdryer or something like that. To me, though, I didn't see the point. Like I said, this is something I do because I find it relaxing, not because I'm trying to just hammer out locomotives and weathering cars as fast as I can. I don't even have a working layout really at the moment. So yeah, I'm going to let it sit out here in the garage and dry for at least another day. The matte top coat still feels a little tacky, so I'm going to make sure it's thoroughly dry. I'm going to maybe throw it on my test track and get some B-roll footage of it running, and that'll be that. So appreciate y'all watching. Stay tuned for more SipSiff Learns You Painting Good.